deep in the heart of the English countryside, have long hidden some of the earliest films ever made in and of China.
Fascinating to see them, the facial expression of these people. It brings everything alive.
It's fantastic. It provides you a window to gaze into the life of the past.
Much of Chinese life and history is here, from the last days of the Qing Dynasty to the start of the Communist Revolution.
This is actually one of the most crucial periods in the formation of modern Chinese history.
It is an era of tragedies and triumph. It really shaped what was to come.
Documenting all of this, I think, is hugely important. It has great historical significance.
Now, for the first time, we can share a lost China, preserved forever and for all on film. These few meters of film are believed to be the earliest images of Chinese people recorded on celluloid.
This is late Qing. It's definitely late Qing from the way they dress. Because they were still wearing queues. I would call this Manchu dress. And these men, they look quite leisurely. They're not working. I mean, they were standing there talking, have a good time. So I presume they're part of the Manchu aristocracy, or they might be scholars. They're definitely not sort of hard-working men.
The films were found in the basement of a shop in the north of England, amongst another 800 or so other films of mainly British subjects shot on 4-perforation British standard negative. But these Chinese images were recorded on film made for Lumiere cameras, made in the Lumiere Brothers factory in Lyon, France.
Lumiere film is different. It has 2 perfectly circular perforations at the head of each frame. The question is, what is a Lumiere film doing amongst 825 non-Lumiere films in Blackburn? Who knows? That's the big mystery.
The Lumiere brothers are amongst the earliest inventors and exploiters of film. They sent their cameramen all over the world and into China in the 1890s. So who filmed what we are watching now?
A large round object blows across the frame from right to left, and it's clearly some kind of boater. You can see how windy it is by the clothes ruffling in the wind. The hat blows off, the 2 gentlemen laugh, and it's all very funny. But you get a notion of who is behind the frame. It's some kind of European, I don't know, bystander, the filmmaker himself, who can tell?
Curiouser and curiouser. When we blow up the image, we see 2 European faces back there. One of them looks like British MP Sir Ernest Hatch. True, he visited China late in 1899 and into early 1900. Could he also have commissioned some of the other films in the archive? The footage of the Laughing Men is just one of the films recently discovered at the British Film Institute. How did all these films end up here?
It comes through donations, sometimes people giving us their home movies. Sometimes it can be a case of an old cinema was having a clear out. They found old reels of nitrate footage. So what you're seeing are films that have come in over years and years, many decades.
This is probably one of the most turbulent eras of Chinese history. Everything is in chaos, so no one's thinking, well, I'd better take up a camera and start filming all of this. So to that extent, the very fact that there were Western journalists, or in fact, just even amateur cameramen going into China and documenting all of this, I think is hugely important. It has great historical significance.
One thing we do know for sure is that this shot of Shanghai's famous Nanjing Road is from the camera of British reporter Joe Rosenthal and was filmed in 1900.
at that footage of Nanjing Road at the very end of the 19th century is like a miniature sociology lesson, but much more interesting than that sounds, because you see all human life that made its way to China is there.
China is actually in a state of semi-colonialism. In fact, that part of Chinese history is described by the Chinese as being guafen, carved up like a melon, because it was, in fact, occupied by so many different Western powers.
And whenever they took to the streets of the international settlement, they were far from camera shy.
The sight of Sikh turbans, policemen, who of course brought from the Indian subcontinent to serve in Shanghai, was one of the more unusual, but at the time actually rather central sites of Nanjing Road, and you can see them parading down in that footage.
These German soldiers on their smoke break didn't and don't feel out of place at all.
There's nothing like actually seeing that kind of footage, seeing the rickshaws, seeing the wheelbarrows, seeing the parading soldiers with German helmets or Sikh turbans. This very international, very imperially driven flavor.
The colonial police and the German soldiers are long gone. Still, there is much of this film that is relevant, even to Nanjing Road today. You just have to look.
So in the background of the shot, this is big, pale, square building, square-ish building, that appears to have some kind of markings on the front that might be pictorial or graphical. So we did some exhaustive Googling, as all research is done now, to turn up as many pictures as possible of Nanjing Road from the period. This building turns up in the backs of this shot, in the foreground of that shot. Characters are written on it. So I think the nearest I ever came to my Blade Runner moment of looking at a picture and saying, enhance, enhance, show me that bit, is peering into the back of this postcard, where at the very background of this image in the postcard appears to be our squarish, pale white building and maybe the same layout of telegraph poles. So, you know, enhance, a little bit of image manipulation to try and lay the two images side by side. And then I set about tracing the roof lines in both of the pictures to see if we could merge the images and see if they overlaid. Lo and behold, I think, pretty sure that we've spotted the same position.
Same location, same business, rebuilt in the 1930s. Some of the same brands have been on sale here since this shop, Shaowansheng, was founded in 1852. Mr. Yu is the general manager.
现在我们看一下我们邵万生最有特色的产品。这个产品呢，就是说呢，创始于1852年。这个就是我们邵万生3个字的最金字招牌。这个产品就是说我们邵万生的仪罗，它是夏天的制品。
These films, in fact any film, has a point of view. Is this point of view of these films still relevant? Are they true windows to this world?
I mean, if we want to be critical, it's shot from a foreign perspective, and which tends to be demonstrating two sides of extreme. On one hand is the very high life, and the other hand is the very low life.
Film and photos are one way of showing how a people live, how different it is from your own civilization or from your own perceptions of that foreign civilization. And I think that there are customs and traditions which may look quaint to a foreign viewer and which have been captured on film and which maybe a Chinese person would not necessarily have filmed. Oh, gosh, not so nice. This one, opium smokers.
In Europe, at the time in the 19th century, the predominant view was that China was a nation of opium smokers and Chinese were all opium smokers. And this kind of image reinforces that view.
As long as we're bearing the awareness that they are showing one-sided image and Chinese society is a much more complex one, they provide a brilliant window for us to gaze into the past.
French consul for southern China, Auguste François, shot these scenes in Kunming in the southern province of Yunnan. Here François has captured what is possibly the earliest recording of Chinese opera.
This is called Dianxi. It was a very popular opera in Yunnan at the time. This performer, the one who played the lady, it's called Danjue. She's the one wearing that funny headgear with the feathers. It's actually he. His name is Li Shaobai. He's a very famous actor of Dianxi at the time. This particular play is based on a story of the female warrior of the Qing Dynasty. It's called Yang Jia Nu Jiang.
Not all he's were as forthright with the she's in day-to-day China. Auguste François also pointed his camera at what he saw as quotidian, daily life, at least to his very French eyes.
It's very interesting. They set her in such a way so you could see her feet, something the Westerners were fascinated by is the bundled feet, the golden lilies of the Chinese women.
She's clearly very shy, and clearly they've been told to sit there while the cameraman just shoots away, and she never looks at the camera at all. And so you can just see her there averting her eyes, you know, and trying to get on with the business of eating.
It's really interesting because it also challenged the dominant view of Chinese women being suppressed. They have no position in the family, and when you see this man and this woman, and the husband and wife sit together, they looked quite equal. And they seem to have a good relationship. I'm actually quite pleased to see an image like that.
It wasn't only foreigners who were obsessed with these so-called golden lilies. Chinese reformers saw them as just one of the many social ills that had to be addressed to be cured.
The female foot is a symbol for social liberation and resisted against the traditional deity. The Chinese revolutionaries went to a different level. It's not just about releasing females from these family boundaries, but also about freeing female as an independent, liberated human.
The fascination with bound feet would be a feature of foreign films for decades. But foot binding is now long gone. And 14 million pairs of feet tread the once forbidden city's grounds. But in the days when it was first captured on film, China's ruler was hidden from view behind these walls. Cixi ruled China for 4 decades as Empress Dowager. She lived and ruled over this vast empire from what is called the Forbidden City, hidden from public view and blind to her country's changing times. Kunming, Yunnan province. In the very early 1900s, new recruits are learning rifle drill.
The character says they are guards of French consulate. We know that in the early 20th century, there were French consulates in Kunming, the Miaos, so they are one of the ethnic groups who lived in southwest of China. And the French probably employed them because as ethnic groups, they were marginalized in Chinese society, so they are more trustworthy. They don't look very professional at all. I think they're still learning. But they would be loyal. They would be more loyal than the Chinese.
Again, the cinematographer was the French consul, Auguste François. For the full 8 years of his post in China, François made film after film, a priceless archive, even recording the consulate's armed protection force.
This footage, I think, is just immediately after the Boxer Rebellion. And there were incidents of the French consulate were looted by the Chinese.
The late Qing period was a time of social unrest. The peasants were impoverished by harvest failures, oppressed by taxes from rapacious landlords, and increasingly hostile to all that was foreign.
In the year 1900, the famous Boxer Uprising, where Chinese peasants, angered at bad social conditions, basically ended up blaming Christian missionaries and the foreign presence more broadly in China for somehow bringing about China's economic and political downfall. And as a result, anti-foreign slogans, the actual persecution and killing of foreign missionaries became an important part of that movement in 1900.
So why risk your life out there when you know what you want to say? This account of the Boxer Uprising was actually filmed in northern England. The costumes and the sets are a bit of a giveaway.
The public are fascinated by what is going on in China. And yet, China is a very long way away. It's not easy to go and dispatch your photographer and suddenly collect pictures of what's happening. So innovative and entrepreneurial characters around the country start to make their own films depicting on what might be happening. They are presenting these films as current affairs, as a reportage of what is happening in China. But what you see is clearly some kind of fabricated action sequence of dubious moral intent. The action is kind of comedic and the violence is just ludicrous.
And yet, our archive reveals that there were those who risked all to be there, to witness and record China as it grew and changed. These images are shot by French Pathé cameramen. They are a dramatic record of real events that followed the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion by foreign troops.
So we see riots, sometimes around food, sometimes around anti-foreigner anger. And these are put down, usually by the Chinese troops at that time. The Qing Dynasty was clearly losing control of the power structure and the economy in the country. Inflation was out of control. So there were still, whatever you might like to call them, Boxer attacks or more really bandit incidents. And we see them, after they've been killed, being put into coffins for transportation back to their home villages, because traditions still demand these things, even if someone is a bandit or a rebel. And we see the police, supervising a crowd and scaring people away, keeping it as orderly as possible.
From the mid-1800s on, foreign powers carved up China bit by bit. This was, and still is called, the century of humiliation. Humiliated or not, China moved on, and in film. The Grand Canal brought the agricultural riches of the south to the more populous north. They say construction started 2,500 years ago, and it continues evolving even to this day.
You need a specialized workforce doing this annual shipping. When you have a harvest, here we go, you have sometimes 2,000-3,000 ships at one go to ship for months from South China to North China to feed bureaucrats and soldiers guarding the Great Wall.
This was an early attempt to film life on China's waterways. The Pathé cinematographers put a camera on a boat. That allowed them to track across the space and reveal much more of what and who they were filming.
They suddenly realize that there's a camera or something strange pointing at them. So they sort of look rather curiously and try to see what's happening. Or maybe it's the photographers telling them, keep back, keep back. But here's one fella right at the front who's very keen to see what's happening. All right, doesn't this just show you what China's all about? People, and that has always been a major challenge for China, how to feed and clothe these hundreds of millions of people.
Salt production in China was controlled by government monopoly. Rebellions and uprisings in the 19th century challenged state control, and widespread smuggling decimated tax revenue.
We know as a fact, every year, 1/3 of China will suffer some sort of natural disasters. 1/3 will break even, 1/3 will have bumper harvest. The Qing system of welfare provision was to get 1/3, which had bumper harvest, to finance the other third that actually move food around. But once the system was ended, at any given year, at any given time, you have a problem. 1/3 of empire is hungry. So that is the beginning of human sufferings. And they have to come to places where you have food, more land, or simply to cities. So European visitors see a lot of poverty concentrated in cities simply because those people lost all the support from the previous government welfare system, which is very unfortunate.
Little wonder foreign filmmakers focused their lenses on poverty, proof to the world that Imperial China was in decline. Shanghai street life, on the other hand, showed some parts of the country were actually on a roll. The foreign settlements of Shanghai were filled with outsiders. So many Chinese had fled famine and upheaval in the countryside that by now they made up 95% of the population of the foreign settlements.
They are the ones that become the majority residents in a place that in the beginning was supposed to be designated for foreigners. And they took advantage of whatever infrastructure and also some legal system that was there. And they became extremely important in almost all spheres of business, culture, and to a certain degree, politics and education. Despite having no formal rights in the settlement.
Not just Shanghai, but all the port cities were booming, with foreign investment kickstarting economic growth. Even the traditional crafts were benefiting from increasing demand. This film is simply called Homework and Street Scenes, portraying intimate vignettes.
These are lantern makers. They're making signs for shops. Before modern advertisements, lanterns were used for a promotion. So if you want to sell some goods, then you hang a lantern. Yeah, this one says 山家楼书场. Shuchang is a type of opera. It's sort of focusing in folk opera, and Shanjialou could be a name of that theater.
And some vignettes were even more intimate still.
This is such an amusing piece of footage. Clearly, the cameraman wants us to see her face, to see her expression, to see her eyes, because she's very pretty. And so he thinks of a ploy. Well, I'll ask her to hold up this piece of embroidery for us all to see, and maybe we can catch a snatch of her face. And so she picks up a piece of embroidery and she says, "You want to see my embroidery? Well, here it is." And up she holds it, and of course conceals her face completely, so we have no idea. She's probably smirking behind that piece.
Not everybody was that camera shy.
From the way she dressed, she's a Manchu and she's quite wealthy. She must came from a wealthy family. It shows China in transition. That cigarettes, it was a modern object. And water pipe was a traditional thing that Manchu women smoked. It was a major pastime. But now she's got a cigarette in her hand.
Yet, she doesn't really look like an aristocratic lady either. And I just wonder whether she might be a brothel keeper.
In the Qing Dynasty, all men, boys even, had to wear queues, prescribed 300 years before the scene was shot, as a sign of obeisance to their Manchu conquerors. Street-side barbershops were often a favorite of filmmakers.
I think it's fascinating to me. I mean, you always just read those stories about the specific style that you should do your hair, because a political symbol is allegiance towards the Manchurian, but you actually never seen them, at least for me. You've never seen how it's professionally done. It's done so casually, and it's just like at the corner of your street. And it's just fascinating, I think. It's really valuable to demonstrate to today's people the normal life of an average Chinese at that time.
Within a few years, this barber's queue plaiting skills would be made redundant. The Manchu queue was banned when the Qing Dynasty was overthrown. This funeral procession captures both the ancient and the very new, filmed on the cusp of China's first Shanghai Revolution.
So funerals are really a recurrent theme in all of the films made by Westerners about China. I think one of the reasons is because it's a public event that's easily accessible by people who may be refused access to an otherwise largely closed society, or at least closed to Western meddling.
It's a funeral procession of a major late Qing Dynasty official who was part of what was known as the self-strengthening movement, which was an attempt by some officials within the Qing Dynasty to reinforce China's strengths in technology and industry. There'd been a lot of resistance to things like ironclad battleships, steam railways and so on. And the self-strengthening movement believed that China would have to move with the times in terms of technology while retaining its traditions and retaining the Qing Dynasty. One of those was a man who formed the Chinese ironworks, Chinese Eastern Ironworks, which you can see here in part of this film. And he created here China's first shipyard that could build ironclad steamers and ironclad battleships, which was a big advance. But of course, for the Qing Dynasty, it was all too little, too late.
A tram passes through the upper left of the scene. New China is overtaking the old. Just like this man, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, challenging imperial rule to create a modern republic and drive foreign powers out. This is one of the more mysterious films from the British Film Institute's collection. But where was it filmed? The identity of the filmmaker who recorded these dock workers and their cargo remains unknown.
I love this film. This is a film that is long misidentified as depicting the Bund in Shanghai. We've even exhibited as such. Look at the history of Shanghai and how it was. And we stumbled across pictures of Guangzhou. And lo and behold, the Nanfang building, otherwise known as the Sun Building, you can line up a historic picture of the Pearl River looking at the Nanfang building with that film today, and there it is. It's a film of Guangzhou.
The Nanfang building was erected in 1922. Then it was known as the Sun Company Department Store, the tallest building in China of its day. It's still there, and rather appropriately, today, it's one vast mobile phone bazaar. In 1923, when this film was made, Guangzhou had become headquarters of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, under the leadership of Dr. Sun Yat-sen.
Sun Yat-sen is probably the single most important exponent of a new ideology in the late 19th century, and that was Chinese nationalism. The idea that China should be a unified nation-state, not just a country that was a traditional empire, but instead it should recast its own identity, find a place in the modern world, and exist in a new form of unified political identity.
In 1919, Chinese activists launched what was to become known as the May 4th movement. Politics discussed behind closed doors till then now spilled out onto the streets. Like these students protesting against imperialism.
There's a big re-evaluation of the Chinese Confucius ideology. You have new scholars that came up in the new universities that today we still hear about them. So you have a group of new Chinese intellectuals that really grew in this university, starting what's called a new cultural movement, translating massively works from overseas, changing the Chinese language, the writing form, the structure of the sentence, and so on. So it's really a period of fascinating change in almost all areas, not just in economics.
Change was coming to China's smaller towns and villages too, as this Methodist missionary film shows.
There were a number of initiatives from 1920s onwards, partly introduced by Western missionaries, Christian missionaries, medical missionaries, and other missionary groups. They worked together with some Chinese reformers who also want to introduce social changes and to, to educate the illiterate mass. China carries this huge baggage of rural mass, and to become a modern nation, you have to, modernize them, and to bring modernity into the countryside.
This film shows the social changes in parts of China, particularly with regard to women.
The part of the modernity is the kind of new ideology, new freedom, or the concept, the role of the woman, and the way women are supposed to behave, have seen fundamental changes. First, coming through the cities, obviously the Western influence really came. But I mean, there are, you could think of several examples, certainly in terms of in the area of education.
And so there were lots of those kind of mass education campaigns and public health campaigns, rural health campaigns introduced by Chinese reformers, health advocates and Christian missionaries.
While the Methodists documented their part in China's modernization, others were more interested in the quaint, the exotic, and the country's heritage.
I absolutely love this film. The film itself is absolutely gorgeous portrayal of a canal town somewhere in southeastern China. Beautiful filmmaking and beautiful photography. Believe it or not, what you're looking at is a black and white film. This is a film that would have been shot on black and white film stock and processed as such. Film is an industry where audiences are always hungry for new content and new styles and new technologies, new methods of presentation. And the invention of stencil color was one way of satisfying audiences' desire for novelty. Stencils can be cut out and then applied by machinery to daub the colors in broadly the same places to simulate natural color.
These hand-tinted images were filmed in a place called Sanqiaopu. We went to Sanqiaopu. It has many ancient bridges, well preserved, but none like the ones in the film. No one there could identify the canals and all that we see in this film. Then as we traveled 150 kilometers further north, we found that the canals of the low-lying delta towns seemed far more similar to those in the film. The much-visited water town of Zhouzhuang is just one of them. Other filmmakers traveled the whole length of the Yangtze, searching for even more picturesque material. This ancient city is barely recognizable today.
Chongqing in the 1920s and 30s was not at the forefront of China's modernity. It's a city built on hills, and therefore one of the most notable things that people spoke about when they came to Chongqing was the fact you'd have to be carried up from the harbor, from the wharf, to the city by men in sedan chairs. These were also the porters who would carry goods from the wharfs up to the city.
Some of the steps are still there, as are some of the so-called bang-bang men. That's what the local porters are called. But nowadays, most people make their way up and down the city by one of the longest escalators in the world.
It was given a bit more of a boost in the mid-1930s when Chiang Kai-shek's government planned that it would become the temporary wartime capital. That thrust it into a national role, which it never had before.
10 years after these shots were taken, foreign audiences were to see a far less quaint image of the city. By this time, it had become the most bombed city in history, as Japan tried to force China to surrender. At the time, the nationalist or Kuomintang leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was trying to unite the country, deal with feuding warlords, and the increasingly popular support for the Communist Party. The Tiananmen Gate, early 20th century Beijing. This great gateway of the city features more than any other building in films of China. As do rickshaws, passing through virtually every shot. In the 1920s and 30s, in Beijing alone, 60,000 or so rickshaws carried about 500,000 fares a day. It's estimated that 1/6 of all men between 18 and 50 were pulling rickshaws. No surprise then that they are the source of one of the most famous novels of Lao She.
Lao She was very representative in the early 1900 Chinese literature, and he's in our textbooks still. Everybody has read Lao She in their high school.
The novel Lotou Xiangzi is the story of a rickshaw puller of the same name. Camel Xiangzi is his English name.
Xiangzi basically lived in 1920s. All he had was a rickshaw that he rented on a daily basis. In Lao She's mind, Beiping was a very corrupted and poor city. There were few middle-class people who were able to hire rickshaw boys, for example. But mostly, Beijing was a town of 1 million extremely poor people, like Camel Xiangzi.
Lao She also focuses on the lives of people going about their lives in the alleys and courtyards, the hutongs and siheyuan of Beijing.
We're actually seeing a very posh, contemporary version of the Beijing courtyard. But imagine, in Lao She's time, the 1920s, there can be 6, 8 families sharing this one courtyard, each room having 6, 8 people living in it, and people everywhere in this courtyard, old people sitting, children running around, young women stitching, working, doing housework, and the men working, looking for job opportunities on the street. People would talk about the latest rumors about other family, quarrels, fighting from another room. This is the private/public life here.
In the past few decades, the alleys, the hutongs of Beijing, have all but disappeared. And the few siheyuan, the courtyards that survive, struggle against the tide of modernization in the city. Long forgotten and yet better preserved at the BFI now is a record of China's first great national spectacle. The funeral of the founder of the Republic of China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who died in March 1925.
It was really interesting actually to see it. And this is the first public event in modern China. Sun Yat-sen's funeral was hugely important. It was very symbolic. It was in Imperial China, funeral position, although it's very elaborate, it's a private thing. It's only families are involved. And this one is a public event. So you keep on seeing group like school children, and there were lots of like officers, etc., etc. They were all walking in groups.
After 90 years lying in darkness, this historic footage only comes to light here now. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek succeeded Dr. Sun as the leader of the Kuomintang nationalists.
Chiang Kai-shek, who was a man who knew how to use military power, came to the forefront of the movement. He led the unification of China that began really in the mid to late 1920s and was marked by the establishment of a national government in the city of Nanjing in 1927.
Chiang intended first to free China of its regional warlords. And then of Mao Zedong and the communists. In 1926, Chiang led his nationalist forces in what was called the Northern Expedition to try to get the country back together again.
During times of turmoil, times of conflict in the 1920s in China, many ordinary Chinese, whether city dwellers or farmers living out in the countryside, found that their day-to-day lives were not only disrupted, but often that they were in mortal danger. They might be cut down by rifles, by swords. They might find that men and women alike would be assaulted by marauding soldiers.
When you add the Japanese threat to all these conflicts, it's no wonder so many people were rushing to find a safe place to hide.
And there was one ironic source of refuge for many of them, the foreign settlements. They were technically under international jurisdiction, and that meant that the Chinese soldiers couldn't enter there. So, of course, while almost all Chinese deeply resented the foreign imperial presence in China in principle, in practice, sometimes they had to flee into those areas of protection to save their own lives.
The Chinese refugees were a compelling subject for many of our cameramen. Their plight was seen around the world. Next, there were thousands of Empire troops coming to protect the Shanghai British concessions and its inhabitants.
Footage of British soldiers marching down the streets of the international settlement of Shanghai, our boys protecting the British presence in Shanghai. Well, in some ways, this footage, these images, sum up the central dilemma of power in Shanghai at that time. Because one of the things we should remember was that Shanghai was many things. It was a cosmopolitan city, it was a trading post, but it was also an outpost of British imperial power. And that meant that when things went wrong from the British point of view, it was those troops who were scrambled, put on the streets in a very clear symbolic display of power to say that when it came to it, British rifles, British troops, British ability to control what was going on in the settlement would be the most important factor.
While Allied forces safeguarded the foreign settlements, Chiang's nationalist Kuomintang troops were massacring Mao Zedong and his communists just the other side of town. Mao and his followers fled to the countryside. The next 2 decades were to be marked by further invasions, an ongoing civil war, and a revolution that would change China and the world. All of which we will share next in China on Film.